non-existent entity. Thus, there cannot be singular propositions about non-existent entities. And here's Timothy Williamson, quote, "A proposition about an item exists only if that item exists. How could something be the proposition that that dog is barking in circumstances in which that dog does not exist? For to be the proposition that that dog is barking is to have a certain relation to that dog, which requires there to be such an item as that dog to which to have the relation." The argument is quite general. Williamson's argument, expressed in Plantinga's terminology, is that a proposition's being directly about a certain dog implies that it is related to that dog. Williamson is a serious actualist. So Williamson concludes that a proposition cannot be directly about an entity that does not exist. So Williamson, along with Adams, concludes that there cannot be singular propositions about entities that do not exist. I reject Adams's and Williamson's conclusion. More importantly, I think that their reasoning on behalf of that conclusion fails. This is because their reasoning, and indeed any argument that moves from serious actualism to the conclusion that a proposition cannot be directly about an entity that does not exist, succeeds only given the following assumption. On your handout, aboutness assumption. Necessarily, this is the assumption, if a proposition is directly about an individual, then that proposition stands in a relation to that individual. But I shall now argue in two different ways that the aboutness assumption is false. Here's the first one. E is an essence of an individual X if and only if necessarily if X exists, then X exemplifies E. And necessarily if an entity exemplifies E, then that entity is X. Let Lincolnicity be an essence of Lincoln. And suppose, along with Plantinga and others, that Lincolnicity exists necessarily. Lincoln himself does not exist necessarily, so there are worlds in which Lincolnicity exists but is not exemplified. So there are worlds in which the proposition that Lincolnicity is not exemplified is true. But surely the truth of the proposition that Lincolnicity is not exemplified is sufficient for the truth of the proposition that Lincoln does not exist. So in worlds in which Lincolnicity is not exemplified, the singular proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true. So there are worlds in which that Lincoln does not exist is true. The non-exemplification of the property, the essence, Lincolnicity is sufficient for the truth of that Lincoln does not exist. But the non-exemplification of a quality like being the 16th president of the United States is not. Similarly, the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true in a world if and only if Lincoln himself, and not merely someone like him, does not exist in that world. All of this illustrates that in worlds in which the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true, that proposition is a singular proposition about Lincoln. So there are worlds in which the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true and is a singular proposition about Lincoln. So there are worlds in which the proposition that Lincoln does not exist is true and is directly about Lincoln. But because serious actualism is true, in those worlds the proposition that Lincoln does not exist stands in no relation to Lincoln. Thus, in those worlds, being directly about does not imply standing in a relation to. Thus, the aboutness assumption is false. This concludes my first argument against the aboutness assumption. My first argument shows that, at least given necessarily existing essences, the aboutness assumption is false. But that argument does not tell us anything about being directly about, other than that being directly about does not imply standing in a relation to. As we shall see, my second argument involves a positive characterization of being directly about, which characterization reveals that the aboutness assumption is false. Recall that Plantinga denies that the proposition that the line of conservatism is wise is directly about Buckley because, says Plantinga, it seems to be about Buckley, quote, only in virtue of the fact that he happens to be the line of conservatism. And recall that Adams says that a singular proposition is about an individual X, but not about X by way of X's qualitative quote, by way of X's qualitative properties or relations to another individual. With these comments in mind from Plantinga and Adams, we can see that the assertion that a proposition is directly about an individual seems to amount to two distinct claims. The first claim is that that proposition is appropriately about in some sense a positive characterization sort of to be waved at. First is that the proposition is appropriately about that individual. And the second claim is just that it's not the case that that proposition is appropriately about that individual in virtue of that individual's qualitative properties or relations. Presumably, if the aboutness assumption is correct, it will be only because the first claim, namely that the proposition in question is appropriately about the relevant individual, implies that that proposition stands in relation to that individual. The second claim merely denies one explanation of the first. It doesn't affirm any relation between them. Conversely, if a proposition is being appropriately about an individual does not imply that that proposition stands in a relation to that individual, then the aboutness assumption is false. So let's focus on what it is for a proposition to be appropriately about something. Look, there's a perfectly evident way in which the proposition, for example, that Plantinga does not exist, is about Al. That proposition's being thus about him is part of what differentiates it from, say, the proposition that Paul K. Zwier does not exist. The proposition that Paul K. Zwier does not exist is about Paul K. Zwier, not Al. Moreover, the proposition that Plantinga does not exist, being thus about Al and denying his existence, explains why his existence makes that proposition false, and also why his non-existence would result in its being true. In general, knowing what a proposition about is in this evident way is required for knowing what it would take for that proposition to be true and for it to be false. The true general proposition that there are no carnivorous cows is in this same perfectly evident way about carnivorous cows. For starters, its being thus about carnivorous cows is part of what differentiates it from, say, the proposition that there are no Frisians. The proposition that there are no Frisians is about Frisians, not carnivorous cows. Also, that there are no carnivorous cows, being about carnivorous cows and denying their existence, explains why that proposition would be false if carnivorous cows did exist. It also explains why the non-existence of carnivorous cows is what makes that there are no carnivorous cows true. Indeed, knowing that that proposition is about carnivorous cows seems to be required for knowing what it would take for it to be true and for it to be false. Again, the proposition that there are no carnivorous cows is in a perfectly evident way about carnivorous cows. But no carnivorous cows exist, and serious actualism is true, so the proposition that there are no carnivorous cows does not stand in any relation to carnivorous cows. Therefore, the way in which the proposition that there are no carnivorous cows is about carnivorous cows does not imply that it stands in any relation to carnivorous cows. More generally, a proposition being thus about something in this evident way does not imply that that proposition stands in any relation to that something. Recall that a proposition is directly about an individual just in case, first, that proposition is appropriately about that individual, and second, it is not the case that that proposition is appropriately about that individual in virtue of that individual's qualitative properties or relations. I think that a proposition is appropriately about that individual if it is about that individual in the evident way just explained. And the way in which that Plantinga does not exist is about Al and would be in worlds where he doesn't exist, and that there are no carnivorous cows is about carnivorous cows. As we have seen, being an individual in this evident way, being about an individual in this evident way does not imply being related to that individual. So I conclude that being appropriately about an individual in this evident way does not imply being related to that individual. And so being directly about an individual does not imply being related to that individual. Thus, the aboutness assumption is false. The above serious actualism-based objection to the existence of singular propositions about non-existent entities depends on the aboutness assumption, and so that objection fails. Dave, is it okay with you if I skip the section on necessary truth?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. It's really a great section, so I'm sorry. But I want to have time to play, ask questions. All right, so I'm going to jump ahead to argument 5. Let phyke be the name of the proposition that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Then the sentence, quote, phyke is true, expresses a singular proposition about the proposition that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Therefore, the proposition that phyke is true is a singular proposition about the proposition that 2 plus 2 equals 4. This illustrates a general point. The point is there are singular propositions about propositions. So there is some proposition P and some other proposition Q such that P is a singular proposition about Q. Moreover, there is some proposition P and some other proposition Q such that P is a singular proposition about Q and Q is a singular proposition about P. Here's one example. Jane uses the description, the proposition that John entertains at T, to fix the referent of P. She then goes on to entertain at T this proposition, that P is true. Suppose John uses the description, the proposition that Jane entertains at T, to fix the reference of Q. John then goes on to entertain at T the proposition that Q is true. Here's another example. Jane uses, quote, the first proposition expressed by John on Tuesday to fix the reference of P. John uses, quote, the first proposition denied by Jane on Monday to fix the reference of Q. First thing Monday, Jane denies the proposition that John's evidence justifies P. First thing Tuesday, John expresses the proposition that Q is about cats. Again, P is a singular proposition about Q, and Q is a singular proposition about P. Defenders of the received view standardly take constituency to be parthood. So suppose constituency is parthood. Then the received view implies, in light of the above cases, that for some proposition P and some numerically distinct proposition Q, following. Q is a part of P, and P is a part of Q. But this implication is false. It's false because the following principle about parthood is true. Principle on your handout, antisymmetry of parthood. For all x and all y, if x is a part of y and y is a part of x,